Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we are going into Barry Morphew's backstory, and of course, the who is the answer to the why. And so we'll be going through a number of aspects in Barry Morphew's backstory. Quite a lot of material has been provided by Chris McDonough, who I see is doing sort of a Joe Kender intro in some of his videos from the interview room. So just tip of the hat to Chris McDonough, who went on the ground to Alexandria in Indiana. And I'll put a link in the description so that you can go and look at some of the landscapes that he walked through and took us through on the ground where Barry and Suzanne grew up. In Indiana. For those who know me, who've read the books that I've written, I'm far more comfortable in the format of a written narrative. So this is quite new to me, but I'm going to try and do my best just to go through the various aspects that make up the profile, the identity of Barry Morphew. And just briefly, we're going to be dealing with certain traits that we've identified, his intensity, the impact that his father, Roger, had on his life, the fact that he was a baseball hero growing up, what it was like when they were high school sweethearts, Barry and Suzanne, the whole motif of trees, the significance of trees in this narrative, as well as hunting. And then I'm going to introduce you to a concept you probably haven't heard before, senescence. And finally, the eighth aspect, we're going to be talking about legacy as something that a man may be thinking about as he starts to grow old, as his hair starts to grey, as the wrinkles start to form. Now, since I'm almost Barry's age myself, maybe a little bit younger, I certainly am Suzanne's age when she lost her life, I feel like I've got something to contribute in this conversation. But I'll decide whether or not to do that. I think some of you will think it's self-indulgent, but it's really when you make it personal, when you share some of the personal things that you are going through at a certain stage of your life, that is when it really becomes real and authentic, this whole true crime investigation. You realize these are real people with real emotions just like ours. And so that's something I might touch on either in this video or in one coming up. Of course, it's much easier and better to do in a narrative way where you can, when you can edit and keep things nice and streamlined. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. To those who have subscribed, thank you very much for joining the most authentic voice in true crime. And let's get started. So the first thing we want to look at is this idea of intensity. It's definitely come up quite a few times. It's difficult to get a handle on Barry Morphew just because he hasn't given a lot of interviews, but in his appeal on camera, you can feel to some extent that sense of intensity where he says on camera, no questions asked, and we'll do everything it takes. Let's listen in.
We'll do whatever it takes to bring you back. We love you, we miss you, your girls need you. No questions asked. However much they want, I will do whatever it takes to get you back. Honey, I love you, and I want you back so bad.
Now, do you think those words, whatever it takes, were part of Barry's vocabulary, part of his psychology, going way back to when he was a young man? Do whatever it takes. And what exactly that means will become clear in a moment. Now, I think if we're talking about Barry's intensity, I think it's only fair to kind of invoke the personality of his wife and look at how they played off one another, what kind of dynamic, what kind of personality the marriage itself had, what kind of personality the couple had as a sort of third dimension. And the answer is, in the same way that Barry was intense, Suzanne was quite docile. She was quite sweet. She was quite soft-spoken and kind of quiet. So you had this dominant personality in Barry, this intense personality, and then you had this sweet, soft, docile personality in Suzanne. I'm not saying that softness is weakness. I mean, she was able to overcome cancer twice, so there's definitely a fighting spirit there. But just in terms of the overt personality, you have an intense individual, and then on the other side, kind of a docile individual. In a weird way, an inverse to the Chris Watts dynamic, where Chris Watts was the docile individual. I think it's kind of similar to Patrick Swayze and Kelsey Berreth, where Patrick Swayze was also kind of a dominant, intense individual, and Kelsey Berreth was more the docile person in the equation, if that makes sense. So if you're already confused, if you're already asking questions, that's good, because you'll see how that brings us to the second point. Where did this intensity come from? Was it nature or nurture? Was it a little bit of both? I do think it probably was a little bit of both. He probably got some of the intensity from his father, but I think some of it was also nurtured, because he got a lot of pressure from his father, Roger Morphew, and in the form of playing baseball. His father wanted his son to be a baseball star, not just a good baseball player, but someone who's going to sort of kick ass and take names, kind of thing. And so there was incredible pressure from Roger for his son to train and be consistent. We've seen it in other sporting families like Andre Agassi, where his father expected him to hit so many 100,000 balls by a certain time. But it was this incredible pressure from Roger that made Barry a goal-orientated, a driven individual, and someone who was very preoccupied with his station in life. He wanted to be a success. He wanted to be someone who would tower over others, right? And to some extent, he achieved that in the early part of his life, in the same way that Chris Watts was apparently an amazing mechanic and thought of going to NASCAR, and Scott Peterson thought he was going to do very well on the PGA golf circuit. So you had this sense of a fairy tale waiting for them, for these men. And then what happened? Well, what happened was Barry became a baseball hero of this town. In fact, his name is sort of memorialized on the, in some of the insignia around the stadium that's there. And you kind of get the feeling that he was a big fish in a small pond, that everybody knew his name, and that he was a hero, right? And the important thing to then bear in mind is, where did he go from there? Where did he go from the heights of high school, the dizzy heights of being this sort of superhero, to whatever he became, right? Now, something Chris McDonough from the interview room highlights in his video is that Barry also wanted to be a football player, but he was kind of forbidden from doing that by his father, because his father didn't want him to get injured. He didn't want his son to scupper his baseball career through some kind of injury. And then ironically, that is exactly what happened. He did get injured. I'm not actually sure how, and I don't think it was through playing football, but ultimately that spelt the end of that phase of his life. And then he went from there to basically being a landscaper. And if you just think about that, the heights of all these kids screaming in the stadiums, and being the apple of everyone's eye, to the sort of fairly nondescript nature of landscaping. And if you look at there's a photo of him actually driving kind of a grader or something like that, a tipper, and he's like kind of in a cage. He's like a tiger in a cage. And I wonder whether that wasn't a sense that he got in this landscaping job. And the other thing that I think is relevant, and we'll deal with it a bit more in the next section, dealing with high school sweethearts, is, in the same way that Suzanne was part of his life when he was a success story, when he was kind of a hero, she was also there to see his flame flicker, to see his glory dim, to see the sheen on the trophy begin to dull, and sort of deaden. And who knows if he had kind of a heart sore feeling, a pining for the glory days. Perhaps Suzanne reminded him in a painful way of the Barry he once was, and that was difficult to face or difficult to deal with. And so he wanted to kind of be released from that. He wanted a reprieve from that. He wanted to almost start a new life in a way, find a new fairy tale for himself. And that brings us to this whole thing about high school sweetheart. So she was a little bit younger than what he was. I think it's something like 3 or 4 years. And as a result, she saw him, a little bit older than her, but basically triumphant, taking the high school stage by storm, kind of thing. And just kind of being a legend in the area, just in terms of the high school community, right? And when you look at photos of them together when they engage, it's kind of a strange photo just because it's so over the top. He looks like Flash Gordon. He looks kind of like a movie star, and she's also kind of got a movie star look about it. And yet they from small town America. They're from little Alexandria. And if you actually go and look up Alexandria, it's a town that has been diminishing. It's been contracting. It's kind of been regressing. And the population now is sort of where it was in the 50s, so 70 years ago. The population now is lower than it was in 1950. And it's been steadily decreasing since the 80s, basically. And the reason for that has been the fortunes of Alexandria have been tied to the fortunes of the auto industry. And as that fell away, so did Alexandria. And that's something else that's quite fascinating to see in Chris McDonough's video on the ground, is that you literally do have this town that is just a shell of its former self. You get a sense that it was once a wonderful place to be, but now it's just like a shell of itself. And one wonders whether that's not an analogy for Barry himself, that Barry's also just become a shell of his former self. And perhaps if he's gone back to Alexandria and has seen that decay and seen things just, breaking down and regressing, whether he sort of has a sense of that being kind of symbolic of himself, that, in seeing the cracks in the road, seeing the derelict structures, seeing the abandoned and broken things, whether that kind of reminds him of how much he had and how much he's lost, just like the town. And I think another kind of topical analogy for that whole thing, an entire town, an entire way of life shutting down because of an industry that begins to stagnate and slow down and degenerate, is nomad land. And you get a sense of loss that's unvoiced, that's unspeakable, and yet it's something that can consume an identity that has been tied to it, so that you are totally lost. You don't know what to do. And, you might be with someone whose identity is very tied to a place like that, and you trying to get away from it. So you could have something like that. And we know that that was the case with them, that Suzanne had a lot of friends there, and she was part of her community there. And I think also there's quite a sense of a religious community in Alexandria. In fact, if you look at the notable people that are from there, quite a few of them are gospel singers. Bill Gaither, Danny Gaither, Gloria Gaither. And so when she moved to Colorado and she became a housewife, she tended to feel quite isolated. And I think this was difficult for her. And so one wonders if she was pining to go back and she was struggling to let go. And that was something that Barry desperately needed, was to let go of Alexandria, of that time. And yet I think he needed to find some kind of legacy beyond that. Now, if I was writing a book on this case, and quite a few people have asked me, am I going to write a book on this case? The same people are asking me if I'm writing a book on Chad Daybell and Laurie Vallow. If I was writing a book on this case, I would definitely make a special provision, a special chapter, perhaps even a special section dealing with trees. And it is actually incredibly fascinating how trees are a kind of constant in the story. You get a sense of that when you walk with Chris McDonough through those undulating green countrysides framed all over the place by the woods. And of course you have woods as well in Colorado. But what I think really gave me a sense of what we're talking about here is when you go and look at the Morphew home, which has now been sold for $1.6 million. If you go and look at the images on Zillow, you get a sense of the tree theme, to what extent it was a feature in the mind, the heart and the mind of Barry Morphew, probably his family as well. That entire house, the interior, feels like the inside of a tree. It feels sort of like a hollowed out tree. The table, the coffee table in the lounge, is a big sort of cross section of a large tree trunk. The portraits on the walls are trees, and where they're not trees, they are antlers or the busts or whatever of stuffed animals, invariably deer or some kind of antelope, I don't know, reindeer or whatever, but basically wild animals sort of coming out of the walls, literally. You have that in and then also the windows, all the windows of the sort of the bedroom and the lounge are filled with trees, right? And if you think about trees, what do trees do? Trees are all about memory, in a sense. In those rings, trees are all about achieving size. That is kind of what a tree's trying to do. I've got trees in my garden, and they're trying to reach for the sky, reach for the light, reach towards the sun faster than the tree next to it, because the one who comes second in that race is going to get less. The one who comes first is going to thrive. And so trees are all about memory and achieving size and significance. And people who grow trees, and this is something that's also quite interesting with Barry, was that he had a tree farm. And I must say, when I thought of Barry as a landscaper, I tended to think about rocks and earth moving and shaping the terrain of the earth. Maybe a tree here and there, but you kind of get the sense that trees were a big part of his palette as a landscaper. And if you think about trees in another way, the person who grows trees in order to transplant them, in order to change or recreate or alter a landscape, then the point of growing trees is to cut them down, if you think about it like that. In certain people, I guess in the forestry business, that is the point. You grow a tree, and I think you have quite a few pine plantations in Colorado. The point of growing those trees is to cut them down. And while I was on a holiday recently, I was mountain biking through pine plantations. It's essentially kind of a ruined landscape. The trees grow, and then when you look again, there's sections where there's absolutely nothing, where those trees have all been chopped down, and then the whole process begins again. And I think the same thing speaks to the what Shakespeare referred to as the stages of a person's life. And people are also like trees. They grow to a point and then they get chopped down. You get to the end of kindergarten and then you're the hero of kindergarten, but then you start from scratch at elementary school, and then you become something at elementary school, then you start from scratch in whatever, middle school or high school, and so it goes on. But you can also be cut down much later in life, right? You can have a sense that you've been cut down, right? And so for those of you who watched the movie Nomadland, Shakespeare was sort of quoted. I thought that was quite a nice touch, but then I am someone who's interested in English and interested in Shakespeare. But Shakespeare, when he talks about the stages of man, he says there are 7 stages. He says, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail, unwillingly to school, and then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow, then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation, even in the cannon's mouth, and then the justice, in fair round belly with good capon lined, and with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouts on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide, for his shrunk shank and his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all, that ends the strange, eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And so these 7 ages of men include infancy, the schoolboy, the teenager, the young man, middle-aged, old-aged, and then dotage and death. Now I think where Barry found himself at this time is between middle-aged and kind of old-aged. You could also argue that it's between young man and middle-aged. Maybe he perceived himself as a young man and suddenly he's old, something like that. I've had people criticizing me saying, you don't know anything or whatever. Well, you can do away with that then. You could say it's got nothing to do with age, but then what is your theory? And please don't say it's because he's evil, because you could use that for every single crime. Just say, oh no, well, this person's evil. There's good and evil in all people. So that's not an explanation. And I will be doing another video dealing with 2 crucial ingredients that you get in every single crime, but that really reveals a lot in ways that you often can't imagine. And that has got to do with time. So we'll be looking at that in due course. The other thing I want to mention about trees, and I also dealt with that to some extent in my book on Patrick Frazee, in my book Murder Most Foul. I think there's a chapter dealing with landscape and memory, and that was just such an important chapter to write, just getting to know the landscape around where his ranch was, and the kind of terrain that you're talking about, and how that can shape a person's psychology, how the landscape can literally impact our psychology and our approach to life and all that kind of thing in ways that you often can't imagine. And the interesting thing with the landscape is it's also imbued with memory. There are things in the landscape that sometimes, I think, awaken ancient memory and sometimes recent memory. Someone who writes very provocatively on all of this is Simon Sharma. In fact, his book is called Landscape and Memory. And he talks about Arcadia. There was a time in the history of the world where people had found a way to tame nature, tame the great outdoors. And you found this particularly in Europe and in Britain, where nature was becoming a garden, and the garden was kind of a part of the countryside surrounding sort of large country estates. And you sort of had rolling lawns, and instead of wild brush and hedges, manicured hedges and flower beds and things like that. And that was the beginning of the shaping of Arcadia. And you get a real sense of that in parts of Alexandria. You get a sense of Arcadia, of a time that everyone once lived, where it was between the suburbs and the city and the wild countryside. It's that sort of in-between period where one person's lawn would sort of roll into another person's without there necessarily being a boundary, where you could walk from your lawn onto kind of a golf course or into the woods. And how many places are there that are still like that? And you get a sense of that right at the end of the movie Nomadland as well, that something that has been lost in the great march of the trees of industry has been this access to the countryside, to these beautiful spaces where people could play. And so I'm just going to quote from Simon Sharma's book. He talks about it being equally mistaken to imagine the medieval English forest as vast green tanks of silence, dense, impenetrable, and deserted places populated only by bandits and hermits. The expectation that there ought to be hermits in the woods was such that King Stephen went to the length of setting one up in a customized rustic cell in Rittle Forest. And so he goes on. He talks about the wild animals of the chase often shared the woods with the domestic livestock pastured by the cottagers. Cattle, horses, sheep, and even goats grazed the underwood and any clearings caught naturally by the fall of old trees. And so he goes on and on. There's just so much to talk about here. Ancient lightning-blasted trees, trunks and roots fallen and decayed into shapes suggestive enough to earn nicknames. Winding brooks, ponds and bogs, hummocks and slopes. The ruins of older hearths and walls, the rubble of fugitives, the cinders of charcoal burners. Cart tracks, footpaths and trails were as familiar as Roman roads. And you can go on and on and on, talking about living in the woods and the green forest and all that kind of thing. For some people, that is part of our backstory in terms of our great-great-great-great-grandparents. That they came out of the woods. Perhaps they were carpenters. Perhaps they turned forests into sailing ships or windmills in the Netherlands, or wooden fortresses in Britain. The original castles were made of wood, and so it's got quite an ancient sort of part to play in a sense. But the other thing with trees, for me in this story and how it applies to Barry Morphew, is the sense I get is that there was a lot of intensity, there was a lot of pressure to perform, and he would go and play his baseball. He got quite a lot of fame and notoriety, but I think the relief that he would get from all of that was when he went into the woods, and there he would have immediate supremacy, there he would have immediate preeminence. He would often shoot raccoons and skin them and sell them for, I don't know, was it $30 or something? And if you think about what preeminence is, it means simply exceeding others. And so if it was a struggle to get somewhere in baseball, if it was frustrating not to be able to play football, if it was just the struggle to transition from the dizzy heights of being a baseball star to being injured and to whatever to follow. Well, when he went hunting, he had an immediate sense of preeminence in nature, that he was smarter than the animals he was tracking, that he was more alive and capable of killing and finding and trapping and whatever, all these wild animals that had mastery of their environment, but he was nevertheless masters of them. And so it was a place where he had control, where he had a sense of supremacy, I guess, right? There was a kind of a sense of primacy, and they were under his aegis, right? And one gets the sense that didn't that follow him to Colorado? And so wasn't there a sense perhaps when he was frustrated with his life in whatever way, that he would go out into nature and find himself again, find his finger on the trigger, get that familiar sense from his childhood of control and domination by, being able to find and kill these creatures and gut them, and convert a living thing into something else, whether it's food or gloves or something like that kind of thing. And so you do get the sense that was a refuge for him. Hunting was a refuge for him from the travails of life. And one wonders whether that wasn't something that came back to him in Colorado, but in a way that was sort of twisted, in a way that was darkened by a lot of disappointment in life, and a lot of, it's a long time coming, a period of being affected by the past that didn't measure up to what his father wanted it to be, perhaps what he wanted it to be, because he never became that baseball star in real life. He became a landscaper. His wife had cancer, and all of that is a long fall from the play that he thought he was going to play, right? So it's hard to say. I don't know whether Barry felt that landscaping was a lowly profession, but if you compare someone in landscaping to someone who's playing baseball, they couldn't be more different. The one is fairly solitary, fairly plodding, fairly slow moving, fairly rooted to the ground, whereas baseball is about swinging a club, sometimes a wooden club, sometimes not, but being very buoyant, very mobile, it's kind of something that's full of bounce, whereas the landscaping is something that is stuck. Compare that to something like a snail that is trying to move over dry earth and it's running out of moisture. It's like too little butter over too much bread. That's kind of the sense that I get. And so I don't know whether he perceived himself as low in status and that this was actually eating at him, and that he wanted something, he wanted a return to that preeminence. And if there's one way to measure one's primacy over the world, it is through money. I'm not saying it's the right way, and I'm not saying it's the only way, but one way to do it is to say, well, because money is like stored up life, and if you don't have any, then you are going to be stuck. You're going to be that snail. You're going to be too little butter over too much bread. And so if you're running out of money, you're running out of life. And how is there a way to cheat death? How is there a way to cheat debt? And I think it's possible that perhaps he came up with the same quote-unquote solution as Chris Watts did, which is, well, what if you just sell this house and then you don't share it? Then you can get to walk away and make a brand new start. Why not? So we're bumping now a little bit against motive, but I'm not going to deal with that here. I'll deal with that in a separate video. But that brings us to the seventh point, senescence. And if you've never heard that word before, it basically means the condition or process of deterioration with age. It's basically just what happens when we get older. There's the loss of the cell's power of division and growth. It's just kind of the slow degradation of the body. It is the environmental factors that affect aging. It could be overexposure to sunshine causing wrinkles or skin cancer or skin aging. It is oxidative stress, DNA damage, not being able to see clearly anymore, not being able to hear so well. And although this starts in your 20s, it really starts to kick in your late 40s, and which is why certain cancers, that they tend to say, well, you don't need to worry about that until about the age of 50. Senescence is associated with inflammation, immune aging, just ordinary biological aging, and it's just basically the beginning of dying. Basically, it's just the slow downhill process into the dirt, right? And I was actually reading a book about it while I was on holiday, and talking about, the book is really about how exercise can slow it down. You can't stop it, but you can slow it down, and certain processes that have already begun can be to some extent reversed. But if you consider everything we've spoken about so far, Barry's intensity, the pressure from his father, becoming a baseball hero, and then that sort of frittering away, being high school sweethearts, and Barry apparently always having a girl at his side, and being kind of a celebrity, this big fish in a small pond. Apparently would often do bicep curls so that when he was driving his red Cutlass, his vehicle when he was in high school, that the girls could see his biceps. All of this is about primacy, about him being, the kind of apex predator, him being the stud muffin of Alexandria. The whole thing of a man as a tree, developing the strong trunk, growing from a sapling into this towering, person or creature reaching for the sun, reaching for the stars, reaching for the sky, radiating its arms to catch all the glory of the sun, right? And then hunting as another extension of that, as someone who continues with that intensity, continues to be a hero in his own sort of neck of the woods, so to speak, and then at the end of all of that, at the end of that struggle to become a person of value, to become a shining symbol, a shining star, there's this senescence, which is the decline of the star just returning to the void, and what do you do with that? And then right next to that, you have again this cancer creeping up, and just that sense of, I don't want to go gently into the night. I want to push back at this. I don't want to. I want to go back. I want to be at my zenith again. Maybe I want a second life. Maybe I want a second chance. Maybe I want a second bite at the cherry. Maybe I want to be a hero again. I do think it's interesting that all of this happened. Suzanne disappeared, I think something like a week after what would have been the day that Roger died, the anniversary of that day. So Roger died on the 3rd of May, and that probably just that the death of his father would probably be something that was in the heart of the hunter. What kind of person he was, his father, and what kind of person he wanted Barry to be, and was he that person? And I get the sense that somehow, even with his father being absent, somehow that pressure was still there. That pressure was still there to perform, to be something. And did he feel that his wife was holding him back? Did he feel that, or did he need something from her that was going to give him his shot at whatever it was that he wanted? Did he need something from her that he didn't want to share with her? Well, we almost at 40 minutes, so I'm going to end off just talking about legacy, and that being related to potency or impotence. And so at this stage of one's life, or perhaps even a little bit later, a man does start to contemplate his legacy. And what I mean is, you think about your legacy as a young man, and then it seems to almost rub you the wrong way when you think, well, who am I now, right? And am I going to allow senescence to just go its natural course, or am I going to find some of that substance I had as a young man and, do one last push, right? And you had a lot of people in the 96 Everest disaster that I think were doing that. They were trying to have a second life. They were people in their late 40s or even older. And it's the battle between impotence and trying to feel potent, feel a sense of potency in oneself and in the world. And it's something that you can project or recognize in yourself through things like money, through your sexuality. Are you able to attract people of the opposite sex, or someone that you're at least attracted to? What new achievements or adventures can you go on? What new life can you live? It is to some extent represented through materialistic things. What car you're driving, what clothes do you wear, and also your physicality. Are you strong? Are you fit? Do you look younger than what you are? And all of this, if it's not resolved, can lead to a midlife crisis. You might suddenly feel in a hurry to lose a lot of weight, to visit the gym quite often, to buy a new car, to change your home, to just change your life completely. And I wonder whether that sense of legacy in crisis wasn't what was going on with Barry. And you might sniff at that and say, no, I don't think so. But you've got to bear in mind, you're not Barry. Barry was this guy that had kind of an intensity about him all his life, but particularly as a young man. And I think that intensity was still there as an older man. And who knows what those feelings of intensity were pushing him to think and do, and sort of what they were driving him towards. The pressure that Roger put on him probably meant that when Roger was no longer there, he was putting pressure on himself. To what end, we can't be completely sure, but it was probably something to do with reasserting his manliness, and whether that was applicable to another woman or just kind of in a general sense, but possibly including other women as well. It's difficult to say. I do think money was a big part of this, and money can be a way that someone can feel emasculated, especially when one person is in control of the money, or some other force or some other factor is in charge of the purse strings, as we saw with Chris Watts. If you aren't in control of money in your life, then you're going to feel emasculated. You're going to feel that you're not in control, and that can be a source of anxiety and pressure and intensity all of its own. So one does wonder specifically what it was that Barry wanted, but I think in a general sense it's quite clear that he wanted a return to finding his potency. And maybe what he wanted from that was freedom. Freedom from domestic things, freedom from medical bills, freedom from sickness, things like that. In Chris McDonough's video, again, there's a link to it in the description. Near the end, he refers to a love letter from Suzanne that Barry shared, and it refers to the kiss that Barry gave her at the front door, and the long talks they had on the golf course between the third tee and the green. And so you had these strips of land, of sort of semi-manicured land, I guess, to some extent, kind of adjoining their homes, connecting this kind of almost utopian Arcadia. And there's something quaint about that. There's something beautiful and special, and wonderful memories about that, a kind of a warm and fuzzy thing. But then there's also a sense that that's been lost, And where you're going to find something like that again when the whole town of Alexandria is going through its own kind of senescence. And so you get a sense then through this backstory of shadows and crisis and forces that are at work, psychological forces that are at work, that are coming from a long ways away, don't you? So when you have a relative, and I think it was Suzanne's sister saying to some news agency, news outlet, that she believes the motive is financial, I think that's an oversimplification. Not that that's not true, but it's much broader than that. But we'll be speaking about motive in another video. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.